Hi, welcome to the Come Off Conqueror show. I'm your host, Bonnie, and with me today I've got Josh Brazier and Hollie Henderson.
Yep.
Correct?
You got it.
And they are the authors of an incredible book called Bang Head Here. And I wish I had my paper copy, but it hasn't come yet. I listened to the whole thing on Audible, and I have listened to several parts twice because it was that good. I loved this book. It's life-changing, I think, for everyone who will take it seriously and really take their ego out, if I might say that, because I think it challenges us to really examine us and our belief systems and what we're doing to impact our children. So before I jump into really what the book's about, let me tell you more about Josh and Hollie and why they're here today, why I asked them to be interviewed. I've known Josh for a little while. I volunteered with his organization Kaizen back in my 20s. And back then we were working in orphanages and different schools in Mexico, and it was really fun. And that's about when you launched your Kaizen youth program, correct? Your at-risk youth program.
Right. Yeah.
And taking them around to different parts of the world and doing humanitarian missions and helping that facilitate more healing and kind of working through some issues through that process. Will you kind of explain how that works? And then we'll jump into Hollie's side.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was kind of a natural extension of doing service work. We'd have a lot of young people come on Kaizen trips. Parents would call afterwards and say, "Hey, my son or daughter really connected with you. They're kind of struggling. Would you mind talking with them?" And from there came the idea, like, wow, like service is a really great way to introduce a safe space, a space where they have a lot of meaning, where they're working hard, they're beyond their comfort levels, like their home world is very controlled. But when they're in Mexico and there's lots going on and they've got all these kids, it just opened up a lot of doors, a lot of conversations. And from my humanitarian therapy program that we started through Kaizen, we've just been able to help a lot of people heal and access those parts of them that they've been holding on to kind of bring it to the light and find healing. Lots of traumas, lots of addictions, just different things like that we've been able to kind of work through in that environment.
That's so cool. And then Hollie, you guys knew each other back in high school, correct? You guys were friends back then, and then you both kind of went this humanitarian route as well. Hollie started working for Interface Children and Family Services, correct? Mm-hmm. As a domestic violence, in their domestic violence division, as a teen dating violence prevention specialist, which naturally has me intrigued, as this show is about victims of abuse and trauma along those lines, and a lot of them were teens when some of this abuse happened. And you were training thousands of teens and educators and community leaders how to deal with this violence and how to heal from it and how to prevent it. I'm gathering from that.
Yeah, I would work in the schools, colleges, or lockdown facilities, or like jails, talking about family violence, how to recognize it in a relationship, how to prevent that, what happens if you encounter violence, how to heal from that, what are some resources you can go to, to help you through the trauma of family violence. But ultimately, our goal was to prevent it because in the past, a lot of people just didn't want to talk about it. It was hush hush, it's behind closed doors. And we know that in order for a family to change, we have to educate people in advance of what a healthy relationship looks like, because they just recycle that relationship that they experience. So yeah, I did a lot of work with that. And then prior to that, I was an at-risk youth. So I lived away from home for a bit, was in treatment, dealt with eating disorder as well. And so there's a lot of history that I have in learning to come back to the family environment and home environment and reconnect with a broken situation between myself and my parents. And so from that work and the work I've done with teens, and then the work that Josh has done, we came together on one day and we just had been talking about our path, like catching up, and realized that there was a gap there of service that was needed for parents deeply, to help them in their journey with reconnecting with their loved ones that were struggling. You know, their loved one was in treatment, but there was not a lot of support for them. So we wanted to create this book, Bang Head Here, in the series, a 3-part series for parents specifically. And like you said, it is something where you have to take your sensitive sweater off and say, I'm ready to do the work that I know needs to happen in order to make this environment better. Because in any situation where you've got somebody who is struggling or in rehabilitation, it's a family systems issue that needs to be addressed, not just the one person. So we wanted to introduce that now to people to start taking a look at it differently.
Oh, and it is awesome. I'm going to change our view here to speaker view, so it'll be hopefully a little bit better viewing experience for our listeners or our watchers. The book Bang Head Here, so was a brainchild of you guys coming together from that lunch or whatever, and deciding to do this with parents. How did you when you were writing the book, how do I ask this question? Coming from the lens of, I have had several loved ones and friends who have been both the parent in this situation and the teen. And I know, like you said, there isn't a ton of support for the parent. One family I'm thinking of in particular, they've joined some different support groups and stuff, but they were really resistant to admit that they had any part in their child's, I don't know, I want to say this as gently as I can, becoming the person they were, if that makes sense. Like, they didn't want to. I remember them telling me about a time when they were sitting down with therapy and the child's therapist, and the therapist saying, you know, you're part of the problem. Essentially, you're enabling your child to continue getting these drugs by not holding them accountable. And he started placing blame on the parents. And I'm not saying that that's what you're doing in this book, but that's how my friend took it. That's how she felt. She felt like she was being blamed for her child's behavior. And it was really hard to listen to that. And then over time, she came to believe that she was a part of the problem and that some of the things she was doing was contributing. But when I read your book, I don't feel like you're blaming the parent by any means. Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct. Yeah.
It's more that because we're in a family situation, we all impact each other, whether we like it or not, right? Like, that's when you're living with somebody, you can't help but impact them, right? For good or for worse. And as the parent, our parenting and the way we model behaviors and the way we bring up our children contributes to the way they react to the world around them. That doesn't mean that you caused it, because they have their own agency, right? They can make their own decisions. But what do you say to that parent who is maybe not ready or not willing to admit that they've made an impact? Like, what happens with that conversation when you're talking with those parents?
We've been in a few, right? And there is this delicate dance in people's mind between like nurture and nature, right? Like, hey, like my son or my daughter just came this way. And then there's also the side of it that's, you know, I was conditioned a certain way growing up. I had a certain subset of life situations and experiences that created who I'm as a person. I'm bringing that to my parenting. In adopting the 2 boys that I've adopted, they've come on with their own traumas and their own outlooks in life already set in stone. And I've had to kind of understand and look at that delicate dance that's been happening. Like, how do I now, as a parent, have influence on this person who has a bunch of nature that's kind of come into play and a certain set of nurture that's come into play? And then where do I kind of act and react? And so a lot of our approach in this book is, like you said, is not calling out parents and saying you're bad, blaming. It's really hard not to personalize when it's such an important relationship like your child, right? But if we can see and if we can accept, and in a lot of those conversations just said like a simple question of just like, can you see just a little bit, one thing that you have done to have influence on your kid, then that opens up the door that there is a myriad of different ways that we've had influence on our kids, right? From like we were talking about earlier in our pre-interview of like what food they're eating, what they're wearing. We have influence. And so that's empowering to know that. It's not disempowering to know that. And that's part of the conversation. There's a lot of ways I can kind of answer that, but I think that's the most important thing, is that to tell a parent that to know that you have influence on your kids, empowering. It's not disempowering. And if things aren't going right now, when things can get better, it will take time, but be empowered by this situation. Don't be disempowered by it.
I like that it's encouraging to know that you can have an influence to help change what's going on. It's not, yeah, I like that. It's encouraging and empowering. Yeah. When, now let's jump into kind of what we talked about earlier about the how, now, you know that many people in our group are abuse victims themselves, and they're also parents of victims and survivors of different traumas and things. In what ways do you feel like this book would be helpful to, I can tell you what I think, in what ways it could be helpful to those parents, but what are some things that you teach in this book that you think would be beneficial for those parents?
Hollie and I kind of have a rhythm where I'll always start and then she'll kind of follow up. So if it seems, that's kind of how we do things, just to make things clear and not talking over each other. These are some really delicate and tough topics, right? And the book was written for people who are going through this, for this exact same thing. And I think that there's a couple of things that I always take away. We say very early on in the book that you are the most important person in your child's life, right? And so that's also a very empowering place to come from. And talking with somebody who's dealt with trauma or with some type of abuse or anything like that, the main thing that you're going to need to be able to do is get as much information as you can about what's going on and how the many different layers that there are. Like, I've been through things in my childhood that I've had to, I can relate to everybody in this group probably. And there's so many layers to it. There's so much context to it that communication and that relationship becomes the most important part of the healing process, in my opinion. And that's what we talk about in the book, is that what we're trying to do is set yourself up as a parent to take yourself out of the equation as being a negative or holding back or letting your ego get in the way from really connecting with your loved one who's struggling, but to then become a kind of a co-partner in that, so that you can get as much of the contents, the context, the nuance, the details of what's going on, so that you can provide and kind of plan the best healing path possible. And we go through a lot of that with the book. And starting with that is, how do you deal with your own pain? If you don't know how to deal with your own pain, then you're not going to be able to help your kid to be able to deal with their pain, right? Mm-hmm. I know Hollie has some beautiful things to say around that, but that's just what really kind of hits me with my own personal journey with trauma and abuse. And then also kind of going forward with what I needed to do was, I just needed people to understand what was going on with me, so then I can unpack it in a safe place and then find a way forward from it all.
One of the struggles, especially if somebody has been a victim of violence, whether it's physical, let's say it's physical violence, is the person that was their caretaker really struggled to disengage. They were very reactive. And we talk about this in this book because that impulse can really dampen a relationship very quickly, especially with a child or a teenager over time, And if parents don't recognize when they're being reactive and when their thoughts are actually maybe not accurate, then they can create a lot of problem or trauma in a relationship. So we ask them to disengage, step back, go from a bird's eye view of what they think is going on, take a look, ask more questions, then separate it, figure out what about the situation is actually about my teenager, or what about this is triggering me about what I went through that I need to get through and heal. And is this the battlefield that I need to die on today? There's a lot of times that parents decide like, I need to fight this battle. This is a big thing, when they realize like, this actually isn't the battle for them. This is my own battle I need to deal with. And I'll circle back and then say, oh, you know what? What just happened was interesting. What came up for me was an experience I was dealing with. It wasn't anything about you. I had to kind of unpack that a little bit, but I'm curious now. Walk me through what's going on with you, where they can get more information. And then to properly label what's going on. Josh, we talked about this before. Tell me a little bit more about labeling that you were feeling like is necessary now.
So a part of what we do a lot in our coaching is really allowing, and it's part of the book as well, when we introduce people into like what their default settings are and their patterns and how they deal with pain and discomfort, is that we often don't know how to label exactly what's going on with us. Mm-hmm. So I'll get a client that'll come to me and they'll call me and they're like, I'm just so pissed. And I'm like, okay, great. But that's just very surface level. That's very, very vague. So what's going on? We dig a little bit deeper. Well, this just happened at school. Okay, well, what did that trigger in you? Okay, well, you're maybe not really mad. You're actually feeling very isolated and a little bit lonely. And that's creating these behaviors. And it's causing you to think that you need this in order to numb or to be able to kind of solve what you're feeling. And there's a large lack in our family cultures and just in society in general of not going and over identifying with our first feeling or our first emotion, but to really take that breath and that step back into that disengagement, whether you're just alone or with somebody else, to really truly dig and fully label and appropriately label what you're feeling so that you can react from a place of power versus a place of just pure reaction, right? And so a lot of what we do and what we talk about is, what is it that you're actually feeling and what's in the driver's seat versus what you're initially feeling what's going on, because that's normally, or in most cases, not really what's the most important thing, right? So
that's great, you guys. When I was reading the book, I think I said this, I came at it thinking, this is going to be a great book for our group. I thought about a bunch of friends whose kids were in treatment centers or doing drugs, and just different people who I thought of could use this book. And I was reading it mostly so I could relay the information and tell them, go read this book and this is what it's about. And then quickly realized that that was a very judgmental view. And I myself really needed to read the book. So I apologize for thinking, I didn't mean it in like a holier than thou attitude. It was more of just, this is going to be a great resource for them, but realized it was also a great resource for me. Because there's one part in the book where you talk about keeping your children from feeling pain and how it can cripple them for being resilient. And emotional resiliency is kind of a buzzword lately. It seems like it's everywhere, and people are talking about being able to bounce back and handle the struggles of life, and your ability to cope impacts your ability to really succeed in life, whatever that means to you. And I realized that as a mother hen, I was keeping my children from being adventurous and trying out new things, and perpetuating this perfectionism mentality that I've had for most of my life. And clearly I'm not perfect. I've made a million mistakes today just in this one show trying to get this going. But those things used to really bother me. Like I would have, had this been about a year ago, I would have unraveled from having all that chaos happen just now. But I've been able to set back and be like, mistakes happen. doesn't mean that I'm a terrible person. I can still be a nice person and a good person and care about people, even if I'm not the best interviewer, even if I'm not, qualified like all these other people, blah, 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 whatever it is. But how do you, so my question to you is, as a parent who has some of these, you're talking about earlier, the preconceived, the programming that we come into parenting with, right? Like things that we've been conditioned and some of these belief systems and things that we've had. How do we, one of the things you also talk about in there is modeling appropriate coping strategies and things like that. So how do we keep our programming, I guess, in check and realize that we're perpetuating the problem? One of the things you talked about earlier, Hollie, was educating to stop the violence in families, is stopping that cycle, right? So how do you be a cycle breaker? It took me long enough to get to that question. How do you recognize that that's what's going on? And then how do you work on breaking that cycle so you don't perpetuate those bad behaviors, I guess?
In regards to pain, like managing pain?
Well, not just pain, but like just anything in general, like pain or just not coping correctly. Like it could be my need for control, right? And like, I don't know, just things in general, some of these unhealthy behaviors.
Josh, did you want me to take this? You want to start?
Yeah, I can start as well. Yeah, totally fine. I mean, these are really nuanced and very, like we've been saying, very deep topics, right? When we're telling somebody, you got to start bringing some things into your self-awareness about yourself, and you need to be able to learn to keep them there, so that when a situation arises, when you need to cope with something, when there's a conflict, that it's there close in your self-awareness to where you can stop yourself quicker and quicker with each and every time, right? That's how you become a cycle breaker in a very simplistic view, right? When you know something about yourself, when you have that self-awareness, that insight that says, okay, when my son or my daughter comes to me and they want something from me, it triggers something deep in me. And I have this reaction where I just say, no, when I was a kid, you had to work for everything. And you're maybe missing some context or some nuance to the situation. Well, that's self-awareness that you said, okay, like I want to stop that. I want to break that particular cycle. But the first step is knowing that you have that cycle. And the second step is keeping it there in your mind and saying, okay, I have to be more and more aware of that and catch it quicker and quicker. It's a very simple way of looking at it. And it might seem too simplistic. But a lot of times with our clients, we're just like, as long as you have this knowledge, if you can work from it, you will start to improve, because none of this will happen overnight. And that's where we were just having this conversation earlier, Hollie and I, that we have an unrealistic expectation of how long these processes take. In the book, we talk about that when a kid is broken down, or when the breakdown has occurred, that was happening months and months or a year, whatever. It was happening a long time before the actual really huge manifestation of whatever it is that's going on with your child. And so we have to understand that that's going to take just as much time, maybe even more, or maybe less, to be able to get things back on track. But to know is to act from that place of power, to say, okay, I know this about myself. And so I can look up different coping strategies for whatever it is that we're dealing with. And then we can start implementing positive coping strategies instead of just going to your phone or blowing up at your kid or trying to control something. The quicker you catch yourself, the more you're going to be able to implement a more positive coping strategy. And so that's why I say first thing with my clients is, whatever insight we have, we're going to keep that front and center for as long as possible until you feel like you have the ability to recognize it quicker and quicker. And I love hearing from my clients, hey, I caught myself from doing this today. Perfect. You just broke a cycle, right? But it just takes that time.
I think going back to your pain, when you're talking about the pain chapter, I think everybody needs to take an assessment of how they're trying to prevent themselves from feeling discomfort, even in their relationships, right? When something uncomfortable comes up, what's the first thing I do? Do I minimize it? Do I try and control it? Do I try and push it off? Do I try and medicate myself to get through it? Once you make that assessment of what you're dealing with pain, then you have a more realistic or not realistic, but a better picture of what to address next. We also need to create a space of compassion around the ones that we have that are addicted. We a lot of times parents will be upset with the way that they're choosing to be an addict or self-medicate, but they fail to look at how they medicate themselves, right? And we need to start creating more conversations about what's a healthy way to deal with pain. And also this part of our past culture that made it say, like, where we learned that if something went wrong, or we were dealt out a card that wasn't cool, that we weren't enough, we didn't have value, that we weren't perfect enough, right? That's got to go away. The reality of life is that you're going to have loss and you're going to have joy, and you can't have joy without the loss. And so this need to show up perfectly has to go. We have to have more empathy, and then talk about when those moments come up, what are we going to do? Are we going to write in a journal? Are we going to call a friend? Or are we going to eat? Or are we going to order stuff? And the problem with teens is that if they're in pain, they're going to actually seek the strongest voice. So the person who introduced them the drug was the strongest voice, and that actually then stimulated the brain and numbed at that moment. Somebody who's a cutter may have heard about cutting, may not know if they like it, but once they cut and the rush of endorphins come in, it becomes addicting, because really the underlying issue is that they don't feel connected, and they don't feel loved, and they don't feel part of a tribe, and that's what we have to really address, right? When it comes to next steps.
Sorry, I just had maybe one thing.
Go ahead. No,
one thing to add. The pain chapter was one of the last chapters we wrote. It wasn't originally planned. And Hollie and I really had to come to understand from our work with our clients and with the families that we're working with, that we had to learn intensely from different things that Hollie was going through, and then that I was going through, how we dealt with our own pain, so that we could provide these kind of resources that we have in the book to say, this is an important thing to look at. Like Hollie was saying, like, there is something behind how you deal with your pain and your discomfort. And there's a lot of conditioning, and there's a lot of just really great insights and information that you'll be able to work on. And like we talked about, bringing it into your self-awareness to then break the cycles. It would have been a different book, I think, if we didn't put that pain chapter in it. And I think that going through that was an important part for us as authors too, to not just write about something, but to really look at what we were personally going through that was painful, and how do we deal with it, and then sharing that with you all, right? And I think that's part of the process too, is for a teen and somebody else who's struggling to see that I'm in pain too, and this is how I deal with it, and this is how I deal with it better, opens the door for them to think differently about how they deal with their pain, or how they should deal with their pain.
Yeah, and if I'm going through pain, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm going through pain, I'm normal like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
I had a teen reach out to me today that said, I'm really stressed out about putting in the applications for college, and you could see she was getting anxious about it. And just to have another mentor say, wow, I know what it's like to be there, and guess what? That's normal. It's okay.
Yeah.
And guess what? Like, look at me now, 20 years later, I'm through it. So you're going to get through it, right? Like, it's helping them manage the emotion that they think is not normal. And so they've got to do something about it to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So, like, no, we're just going to lean into it. And we're going to let it teach us what it needs to teach us. We're not going to rob ourselves from the opportunity to learn a good lesson, because it's there for a reason. And sometimes it's just there to motivate, like to squeeze you into getting what you actually want done. That's not a bad thing, right? But if you numb that, then you don't do that. And then your lessons are learned 20, 30 years down the road.
Yep.
Right.
And that's what we deal with a lot now with these failure to launches, that, I don't know if I really like that term, but just the kids that are unable to be that emotionally resilient, it's because they've been able to over-identify with their pain instead of seeing it as something to either work on, to gain insight from, or to push them towards where they want to go. That chapter wasn't just like, hey, Hollie and I are going to take 2 weeks and we're going to kind of like look at our pain. It was a long time. If I remember right, Hollie, if my memory served us, we really, and it's, yeah, I mean, not to get too personal. But yeah, we both were going through things and we really had to look at it. And it took a while. So we came up with ways that were real, not just.
Yeah, it delayed the book for a couple years.
Yeah.
As we were getting through that section. Yeah.
Was there were there any other parts of the book that were hard to write? Because just personally, it was, you don't have to tell me what parts, but as doing this show, there are times when some of the interviews will be a little more closer to home, and I'm glad I've done them because it's helped me heal my own trauma. And I think that's a big part of why I felt, maybe one of the reasons why I felt compelled to do this show is because I needed the healing myself. But I'm curious for you as an author, especially you, Hollie, saying that you left home for a while and then having to come back around with your parents and make up that relationship. Did that make it easier or harder to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I had to go relive a lot of those moments, which, when you're going through that trauma and that loss, it's kind of hard to go back and, rethink about like, oh yeah, that was really an ugly day. Like, I remember there was a day when my parents were supposed to show up and I could not, I was crawling out of my skin. Like, I was starting to feel a sense of independence coming into my own again, having a voice. I just had been silenced, and so I didn't want to be with them. And I know that was probably really hard for them, like that I had total rejection from my parents at that time. I have so much love and compassion for them because the turning point, I talk about that in the book, was that they were willing to look in the mirror and say, I will change first. And we were fortunate enough to have a really great psychologist at the time to say, you will change first. Because then once I started to see the changes happening at home as a teenager, I said, I will trust and walk through this door. And I also was given a better set of skills to communicate what I was going through. And so were they, right? And that's what we're trying to accomplish in this book. And in the next book, when we talk about cracking the communication code, when we release that, is once we're both at the table equally and open about what we need and sharing, then there's a place where we can meet in the middle. But a lot of times what happens is one person's winning over the other and it crushes, the other person, and vice versa. Either the parents are coward and the child is too dominant, or the other way around, right? And that just doesn't work in a family system. And the odd thing is you can have maybe other children that are adapting okay, and then you have one that's not. But don't be like misguided. The other ones that are adapting may also be dealing with their own trauma. They're just not expressing it the same way, and it'll come out later in their lives. So we do deal with that sometimes with parents that are saying, well, everything's fine except for this one. And there are rare occasions where they are absolutely right. Like there's a behavior disorder that is very, very difficult. And we encourage them. We know it's difficult. We just encourage them to be creative and keep trying different techniques. Nobody gave you a manual for that person. It's going to be a little challenging. Don't take your old skill set that works. Just start all over, right? And that's okay. That's what this book is about, is helping you be flexible within the trauma that you're dealing with or the problems that you're dealing with, right? So.
What about you, Josh? Was the book harder or easier to write because of your own trauma that you were dealing with and face?
So I think at the time when a lot of the book was being written, I was pushing away the stuff that I was dealing with. And a lot of the book was me telling stories and experiences through all of my clients and all these different kind of really intense, very intense experiences that I've had over the last, 17 years doing this. Right. And so for me, that's how I was able to get out, I think, a lot of what I was like dealing with. I know that like Hollie just summed up beautifully, like that idea of what we really wanted to do was just say, hey, it starts with you. And when it starts with you, you're going to set the example and the kid's going to show up. Right. And so I think in the same way the book was that way, like I'm going to start with this book. I'm going to really try to get out of me like all the different things that I have learned through my clients and things like that. And then it gave me a framework to really help myself. Right. I think that there's a lot of things that are in those pages. Hollie would say the same thing, that that we needed to go through ourselves in order to really understand and to really kind of implement. I think I decided a little bit too late to work on my stuff sometimes. And when I say that, meaning I just waited a long time. And to be able to now see how those things show up in my life and have those habits and those patterns and those default settings be a little bit more ingrained, it makes it a little bit more difficult, but it's not impossible. And there's ways and there's modalities and there are coping mechanisms and skills to use that are healthy to kind of get us through whatever it is that we're dealing with. And that hope, I hope comes through on the pages of the book, right? That even though we have to face ourselves, that there's a lot of hope in there as well.
I personally appreciated that you guys shared some personal stories in there and opened up, and I appreciate your clients being willing as well. Those stories were really enriching and really helped drive home the points. I feel like the book's really well written. It really is great. I don't even know how many people I've told about it now that have gotten it themselves, but have also texted me and we talk about the book and a little bit about what they're getting out of it, and it's kind of fun to be able to be an eyewitness to some of that healing, and it's very rewarding. And I'm sure, and I'm not nowhere even near like, I'm not a therapist, I'm not doing any of that. I'm just talking with people about their situations, and the joy I get from watching them heal. I can only imagine it must be like 100-fold for you guys when you can see a family come together and start that healing process. Do you I've kept you for a while here, so I have one last actually probably have more questions than this, but we'll leave with this one. If you are a parent in this situation, let's take the crisis moment. You just found out your teen is involved in something that you don't approve of, or something bad happened to your teen. That moment can be kind of paralyzing, right? And a little bit shattering. You feel like your snow globe may have just fallen off the shelf. What's your suggestion in that moment for the parent?
I'll start off by saying that I've been in a lot of those moments where something has been revealed. And I learned the hard way one time that as a parent, I'm sure we feel like we just want to know everything and we want to be able to control it and solve it and do all of that in that moment that it's been revealed to us. I had a kid that I was working with who revealed to me, some childhood sexual abuse in a pretty intense and long term. Mm-hmm. And I just said, okay, this is what we're going to do. Every Thursday, we're going to 31 Flavors, and we're going to meet. We're going to have some ice cream, and we're going to talk about it. And what he told me later on, and we're still in touch, and we still chat quite often, and I'm still helping him through stuff even years later. But what was important to him at this treatment center is that he can just say, I could rely on a time where I could just come in and talk about it and not feel forced. I could take some time to process. I can take some time to kind of feel through things. And so that's just a little bit of a simple advice to parents right now. Your action is going to be very important. And to be able to, whether it's something negative, like they got caught doing something that you didn't want them to be doing, that reaction is going to set the tone for how things are going to progress in that, in further communications, in the healing, in getting them more information in the context. So please do guard your reaction. Please thank them for letting you know, for the trust that they put in you to know whether it's something like an abuse or a trauma or something that they have done that is pretty negative. And set up times and to come and visit it. Do not feel or reacted to all in that moment, because that will 100% down.
Josh, was you giving your tips? You said through very broken internet to your response is going to make a big impact on them, and being understanding and setting up a time where you can get together so they don't have to tell you everything right away, I think is kind of what you were left off at.
How do you react to walking in on your kid and they just took a bunch of pills? Or, how do you react to a kid when you caught them watching pornography? Or how do you react to your kid if they just came to tell you that this next door neighbor 5 years ago did this or whatever? I mean, the situations are going to vary so much, but it's also going to be important to stay calm, react well, and then let them guide in terms of like, hey, they might just have told you that and they just wanted to get it off their chest. But now it doesn't mean you go into like, solving mode or anything like that, that you need to kind of let it sit and create more opportunities to talk and to understand it, do all those different things so that people, so the teen is guiding. I mean, I think it's an important lesson for parents.
Yeah, I remember one of the families we were studying at the time when we were writing the third part of the series. This mom was so insightful, and her son was going through something that was really difficult. And she felt scared herself. She just didn't really know how she was going to manage it. And her initial thing would be to react and try to control and manage. And she said, I just went up to his room and he was crying. And I just hugged him and I said, it's okay. We're going to get through this together. That's who we are. We're family. We're going to get through this. And it may not be easy and it may take a while, but that's okay. But it's something that we're going to conquer, So we'll be patient. Don't worry, bud. Right. And I just gave him the support at that moment to go like, I am not a bad person. Yes, we make mistakes. I have a team member here. I'm afraid of what's going to be in the future, but she's giving me the support that I need to be there. Right. Flip side, I remember working with another mom who walked in on her son trying to commit suicide. And in that moment, of course, you're going to react. You are in this horrible, traumatic situation. And it's really hard to keep your thoughts together, right? So in that moment, a parent has to think, how do I keep my child safe first? And then how do I step back and take a moment for myself to say, what just happened? And who do I call to help me get my mind organized? Because your mind is all over the place a lot of times in that trauma. And that's just part of dealing with trauma. And find somebody that you can trust to then be organized, but then also gut check yourself that you're not reacting, overreacting, and projecting on the person who is already in deep pain because you're in deep pain. And the hard thing about being a parent is having the self-control to separate so that the family member can deal with what they need to, that's younger, that's not capable, and that you find your resources to deal, right? That takes a lot of control. And there are parents that sometimes make that mistake. And so then the teen feels the weight of not only their own trauma, but the responsibility of their parent. And that's not their job.
Yeah.
Wow. Great advice, you guys. I can't wait for books 2 and 3. When are they coming out? Do you know?
In a year, we were talking about that last week, that we need to have it in a year and a half finalized. So it's coming. But we also want to get people really practicing the techniques now, because book 2 is only going to work if you really have a grasp of book number 1. We did it in succession for a reason, because now we're going to ask people, once they have a level of self-awareness of how they show up and the thoughts that are coming to mind in a reaction, we're now going to say, with that awareness, let's dissect the way you actually speak, talk to someone, and look at how that shows up in their life, and why they're reacting the way that they react. So.
And in the meantime, if they go to joshandhollie.com, we're going to be releasing PDFs with great advice, just different things. And so if they get on our mailing list, they can get some things in the meantime before book 2 comes out. So.
Awesome. I know I'm excited for book 2 and I need to listen to book 1 again. I ordered a paper copy because I needed to be able to like take notes and circle things and reference things again because it was so powerful. It really was fantastic. And I'm very, very grateful. It's made me really have to step back and look at what I'm doing to my kids. Because I think every parent, especially parents who've been through abuse or trauma, they don't want to perpetuate that cycle, right?
Mhm.
And we don't want to hurt our kids. And so these are really great strategies to prevent that, I think. I really feel like if you read this book, you can learn how to become a cycle breaker. And I know that is the goal for everybody in our group. So thank you for giving us a start of a roadmap of how to do that. I really am so grateful. And thank you everybody for watching. I'll put the links in the show notes for Josh and Hollie's website and their book, of course. Hopefully you read it and you love it. Give it a review because it is brand new. So, they live off of those reviews. That's what really helps market those books. I'll also put a link for our Facebook group for those of you who feel like you want to join our community and talk with us and be in an environment where you can share and get support from people who understand what you're going through as well. So thank you. Like the video, share the video, turn on notifications, all that stuff. It helps us get the message out of our show. So thank you again. And thanks again to our guests, Josh and Hollie. You guys, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us and for your kind words. And yeah, appreciate it. Yeah.
Yep. Sounds good. Appreciate it. See ya.